My name is Kevin Davis. I'm the Assistant Chief of Police for the County Police Department. Today, the State's Attorney's Office issued a criminal summons charging Corporal Donald Taylor, a 13-year Prince George's County Police Department veteran, with several misdemeanor crimes, including second-degree assault, reckless endangerment, false statements, and misconduct in office. We have a copy of that charging document, and we'll distribute those at the end of this briefing. This incident stems from a February 3rd of 2012 incident in Brentwood, Maryland, along Rhode Island Avenue, where the initial incident was reported as a police shooting. The involved officer, Corporal Taylor, initially reported to internal affairs investigators on the scene that he had struggled with a suspect who he approached because he thought he was about to commit a robbery. He reported to internal affairs that during that struggle, the involved citizen attempted to disarm him, and that prompted the police shooting. Our internal affairs detectives, as they do in each and every police shooting, responded to the scene, immediately assessed the area for the possibility of surveillance video. They obtained surveillance video from a nearby business, and upon viewing that video, they knew right away that the officer's accounting of events did not match what was on the videotape. The officer was immediately suspended. His police powers have remained suspended to this day. He's on administrative duty. He will face an additional police administrative hearing on Monday to determine his pay status while this criminal prosecution is pending. Our Inspector General and our Chief of Police were involved in this case from the beginning with Major Pacheco, the commander of our internal affairs. We had questions from the very, very beginning, and with the gathering of evidence that occurs on each and every police shooting scene, it was quickly apparent that the officer's version of events did not match what we saw on the videotape, and that's why we're standing here today. Are there any questions?
Can you clarify the timeline a little bit? You say you knew from the beginning, but this obviously happened 6 months ago to the day. So how long have you known from the surveillance? When did you have the surveillance tape? And how long have you basically known that this wasn't correct?
Within a day, the officer was suspended. His police powers were suspended, and he was on a no-contact assignment. Since then, our internal affairs detectives meet and screen the case with prosecutors from the State's Attorney's Office. The State's Attorney's Office evaluates all of the evidence, they interview all of the witnesses, and now at this moment in time, they've made a decision to issue a criminal summons charging Corporal Taylor with various crimes. So it's a process. This process, I would argue, has occurred rather in a timely fashion. The reason why we have internal affairs in place, the reason why the police department has employed an inspector general is because we want to get on top of these critical incidents when they occur, and if any discrepancies exist whatsoever, we want to identify them immediately, like we did in this case, and take the appropriate action, and that's for the benefit of the community. If anything, our police department strives to be transparent in everything we do, and I think this incident, sadly, is a reminder that we are a transparent police department.
If it wasn't because of an attempted robbery, what really sparked the confrontation?
I'm not sure. That's still going to be, well, that is going to be part of the criminal prosecution, so I can't speak to what the state's case will be, and I'm not going to.
Prior relationship?
No.
There
was an observation made by a police officer that two males were acting suspiciously near a gas station. And this was covered pretty extensively. That observation of suspicious activity prompted the police to make or attempt to make a person stop.
What number block of Rhode Island was it?
I'm not sure. Rhode Island Avenue in Brentwood, probably 3800 block.
That sounds about right.
3800 block. So during that person stop, one of the involved citizens fled. What the video shows, and that's part of the state's case, and I'm not going to get into the state's case, is evidence that contradicts the police officer's version of events that he gave internal affairs investigators the night of the event.
Can you go into specifically what the video shows?
Well, the police officer charged this young man with various crimes. Police officers are really tasked with the responsibility that nobody else in society has. We can charge someone with a crime and take someone's freedom away. The police officer, we believe, and the state's attorney's office believes, inappropriately charged a person with a crime that he did not commit. We screened that immediately with the state's attorney's office. Ms. Also Brooks and her staff immediately dropped the criminal charges. Police officers give an initial version of events. Anytime a critical incident, certainly in a police shooting, occurs, the video did not match that officer's version of events. As specific as I can get is the officer described a set of circumstances that prompted him to use force with his firearm, and the videotape did not support those described circumstances.
So the two charges against Ryan Dorn have been dropped?
The 2 charges against Ryan Dorn were dropped a long time ago by the state's attorney's office.
What's the next step for the officer?
A criminal prosecution. The officer, again, he'll face an additional hearing on Monday to see what his pay status will be. The administrative hearing chair will make a recommendation to the chief of police, specifically regarding whether the officer remains suspended with or without pay. So that'll be determined early next week. And then the state's attorney's office has about 180 days to criminally prosecute Corporal Taylor in a court of law on those charges.
And if I'm guilty,
Two officers
Right.
suspended here, what's the status of the other one, or is it possible other people will be charged?
The state's attorney's office has since issued a decline to prosecute letter for the other involved officer, so he will not be criminally prosecuted. That officer still, however, faces an administrative investigation, and that administrative investigation is still underway.
Is he still suspended while that?
His police powers remain suspended, and he's in a non-contact assignment as well. But he is not being criminally prosecuted, and we believe that Corporal Taylor is the only police officer that will be criminally prosecuted in this matter.
and if I'm guilty in criminal prosecution, what is it?
I don't have the penalties in front of me. They're all misdemeanor offenses, so certainly he faces the possibility of being found guilty of several crimes, and then he faces the administrative sanctions that come along with that. So the disappointment the police department has in an officer engaged in misconduct is something that the chief of police and the inspector general have articulated all along. But the faith that we have in our process, the faith that we have in our internal affairs investigators to responsibly collect all evidence, to include videotape that contradicts the versions of events of a police officer, it's that process that allows us to identify police officers who shouldn't be out charging folks with crimes that they didn't commit.
How often does that happen? Is this something that's happening?
Well, I think the fact that it rarely happens is a good thing in law enforcement across the country. But the question really for police chiefs and for communities and for mayors and county executives is, when this happens to my police department in my jurisdiction, my city, my county, my state, what's my police department prepared to do about it? And the Prince George's County Police Department is prepared to identify it, publicly acknowledge it like we have, be transparent about it, and take appropriate action with the prosecutors.
Does this guy have any past run-ins with you guys or with the law? What is his past?
Mr. Dorm,
No, I mean Mr. Corporal Taylor.
Corporal Taylor, I don't have his personnel record available to talk about.
So what are the odds that he ends up off the force?
Well, I think we have to let the criminal prosecution process play out. Obviously, if he's found guilty in a court of law, then he'll lose his job requirements. He faces, regardless of what happens in a court of law, he faces an administrative investigation with termination as a very real possibility.
I'm assuming since this evidence is videotaped, not available.
No, it's only not available because it's evidence in the criminal prosecution.
Can I ask you about something else, the body found in Fort Washington this morning?
Sure.
Any relation to the woman who went missing on Monday?
We have still not positively identified the decedent in that case. We expect to over the next couple of days, but there has been no positive identification in that homicide victim. Once we get that, we'll be sure to share that immediately.
And can you just enumerate for me one more time that the charges that Corporal Donald Taylor, 13-year veteran?
13-year veteran. There's several counts, and we're going to give you a hard copy of the criminal summons, but basically it surrounds second-degree assault, misconduct in office, reckless endangerment, and false statements. And there's several counts regarding each of those crimes.
Do you know if he's been served with that yet? Obviously, he's not in jail.
No, a criminal summons has been personally served today by Internal Affairs. So with the criminal summons, you're not taken into full custody, you're not processed, there's no bond. It's just a notice to appear in court. Any more questions? Any more questions about Fort Washington? Yes.
Okay, I was just going to ask you, can you tell me about the 3 prostitutes that were arrested?
The prostitutes, that was a story that aired on Fox 5 yesterday. Our police department routinely engages in prostitution stings, and we target not only the prostitutes who engage in that conduct, but the Johns. That Route 1 corridor in College Park has been a source of attraction for both prostitutes and Johns for some time now. We arrest every year dozens and dozens and dozens of prostitutes and Johns. And it seems like we've been treading water of late because the prostitutes aren't going away and the Johns aren't going away, which now leads us to a place where we want to engage the hotel business community in more responsible business practices to dissuade prostitutes, pimps, and Johns from doing business in Prince George's County. And some of the ways that that's done is requiring identification for anybody who wants a room, not taking cash, not renting rooms by the half an hour and by the hour, requiring license plate information for each and every person who wants a room. So there are best practices out there in the hotel industry. We don't believe that these hotels along this particular corridor are engaging in those best practices, and we think that the exposure of yesterday's media story might prompt them to do just that.
Just one more question. In this particular case, were there any Latinas involved?
Yes. I'm not sure how many. I know we arrested dozens of folks, and you know it's a crime that knows no racial boundaries. We had white, black, Latina, prostitutes, Johns, you name it. It's certainly the world's oldest profession, but prostitutes, the way that we have traditionally thought about them, walking the streets and being visibly apparent, that's no longer the case. It's all done online now, so it's not as visible. It's not the nuisance crime that it used to be, but it certainly brings with it the potential for armed robberies, for murders, and for sex offenses. And we really want to get a handle on it, but we don't think we can do that without a better engagement by the hotel business community.
Sir, for our colleagues who are already here, could you just go over for them the situation with Corporal Donald Taylor, what's transpired, what you're doing now?
Okay. Corporal Donald Taylor was criminally charged today by a criminal summons by our state's attorney's office with several misdemeanor crimes to include second-degree assault, misconduct in office, reckless endangerment, and false statements stemming from a February 3rd incident in Brentwood along Rhode Island Avenue, where a police-involved shooting was initially reported by the involved officer, Corporal Taylor, as having occurred in a way that recovered videotape recovered by our internal affairs detectives contradicted. So the evidence that our internal affairs detectives gathered at the scene of that police shooting contradicted the involved police officer's version of what happened. The state's attorney's office has since dropped the criminal charges against the defendant, Mr. Dorm, and the police department, Ryan Dorm, D-O-R-M. M as in Mary. And the state's attorney's office has made a decision to criminally prosecute the officer in this case.
So he's no longer an officer?
His police powers are suspended, and he's on an administrative duty assignment right now. He faces an additional administrative hearing next Monday or Tuesday, and that hearing will determine whether or not he remains on duty with or without pay.
And he was relieved of those duties the day after?
Yes, he was.
The day after. And the reason why the charge is just because of the process of going through an indictment and the investigation and everything?
Well, it's several witnesses were involved. Evidence had to be gathered. It may seem like a long time from February to early August, but in the grand scheme of things, not only does the police department want to get this right, but the state's attorney's office certainly wants to get this right before they move forward with the prosecution, because their burden, of course, is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and they want to gather all the appropriate evidence they can.
And Kevin, K-E-V-I-N-D-A-V?
Yeah. I-S, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
One last question. Similar case, has there been any update in Mr. 80, I think how do you pronounce his name? The officer who was accused of shooting a 13-year-old?
No update since our last news conference. That he's being criminally prosecuted as well.
Okay, but I was going to say, because there's something supposed to be happening, or I guess it won't make it this week, it'll probably be next week at this point.
I'm not sure what you were.
Suspension hearing?
Yes.
As with any case where an officer is alleged to engage in misconduct that causes
Can you
the...
give by the microphone?
Sure. As in any case where an officer is alleged to have engaged in misconduct where the department either takes a position discretionarily or or issue what's called a mandatory suspension, that officer is entitled to suspension hearing within a reasonable amount of time after that suspension. It's my understanding that the suspension hearing with regard to that officer as well as others is to determine primarily whether or not the suspension should continue and what the pay status would be. And with regard to that officer, the suspension hearing was gathered, and he has, or I should say, is still, or the decision was made for him to remain on suspension.
Can I ask you, just on an emotional level, I mean, twice in a week? Either one of you,
Well,
twice in a week?
you know, we're the 28th largest police department in the United States of America. There's 18,000 police departments in this country, and we're bigger than all but 28. So we know, law enforcement across the country knows that from time to time, misconduct is going to occur. And like I stated earlier, the test of a police department is not whether or not misconduct occurs, because it occurs everywhere across this country from time to time. The test of a police department is what are you going to do about it when it occurs. And we're at a point right now where we've made an unprecedented appointment of an inspector general to oversee all disciplinary cases on the police department. We've made an unprecedented appointment of a director of media affairs to ensure that when we say we're transparent, we're really transparent. So we get that in 2012, the community has expectations of its police department that primarily revolve around transparency. I think folks know that in a department as large as ours, that there will be an act of misconduct from time to time. We're naive to think that has never occurred or will never occur again. But what we're doing about it, and the way that we're handling these cases, I think says something about not only this police department, but our community. I think our community has faith that when misconduct does occur, that we're going to jump on it. And we have been doing that.